across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. A lot of exciting things happening. Perhaps you had a chance to watch the launch of Artemis II. Of course, we did a program about it recently. Got a commentary coming up in the second hour. We'll get into that in more detail. Moonshot, but nevertheless, 4 astronauts headed towards the moon, coming out of elliptical orbit. We'll talk more about what that might mean and the significance and what happens in the future with Artemis 3 and 4. But that is something we'll talk about in the second hour. And if that's not enough, of course, last night the president addressed the nation on the issue of Iran, and we have a very good piece by William Galston. Some of the tough choices now for the president and others. Also a piece by Marco Rubio about NATO, some very important issues there. And of course, we still have the shutdown, although there is supposed to be a glimmer of hope, but a piece that we will also be quoting from in the second hour from Byron York. So that's all happened in the second hour. You might say, what's happened in the first hour? Well, as we've announced over the last couple of weeks, we are privileged to talk to a number of individuals about their new books on archaeology, which I think illustrates how significant this is. Over the next approximately 3 or 4 months, we will do 3 different interviews on 3 different books by authors on archaeology, which just shows we're almost like in the golden age of apologetics and science and archaeology. And so I'm looking forward to this interview because we were talking about it at the Discovery Institute event just down the road, and Stephen Meyer and I were talking about that, and I did not have a chance to meet Dr. Titus Kennedy because I believe his wife was having a baby at the time, but he is a field archaeologist. He is a research fellow with the Discovery Institute. Just down the road, he also teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. I just watched an interview with him about that. Assistant professor of Bible exposition, a graduate of Biola University, University of Toronto, University of South Africa, an individual that has really been a speaker on a number of different campuses about this very important issue of archaeology. And this new book out, which is published by our friends at Harvest House, Archaeology and the People of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. So if nothing else, Titus Kennedy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, glad to be here.
Sorry I didn't get a chance to meet you face-to-face, but maybe next time you come into Dallas to teach one of your courses here, we'll get a chance to get together. But we certainly appreciate the work that you have done. And I think it's illustrative of the fact that you have picked 130 different individuals. And the way you pick them, you have sort of a 5-point criteria for how these particular names end up in your book. Can you explain?
Yeah. So I really set out to put together a comprehensive list of everyone who's named in the Bible who is also attested in archaeological sources, people for which there is historical evidence for their existence outside of the Bible. So it's not so much that I chose 130, about 135 really is who I addressed in the book, but I tried to get every person that we know about. And there are probably a few others, 2, 3, 4, that I could have put in there, except that the evidence is really tenuous and very, very speculative, so I didn't want to stretch it. But the reason that I targeted this particular theme for this book is that if you talk to scholars, if you talk to the general public, many people, even those who are secular or skeptical of the Bible, they will concede that the Bible is a reliable geography book. And they will even say, yes, those cities existed, and maybe that city was destroyed, but it could just be a story that's set in a historical context. Mm-hmm. So we've got, some modern and some ancient compare and contrast examples that we could give. In the modern era, we've got things like comic books or superheroes like Spider-Man. All right, so Spider-Man is set in New York City. It's not like Superman that's set in fictional metropolis. Well, New York City obviously is a real city. You read the comic books, you look at the pictures, you see things like the Empire State Building. So it's a real place, it's a real historical setting, real buildings. But obviously, Spider-Man is not a real person. Peter Parker is not a real person. So people understand the difference between historical context and fiction, or we could call it mythology. Now, if we go back in time, a more appropriate comparison, I think, for the Bible would be the writings of Homer, and specifically the Iliad. If we read through the Iliad, detailed descriptions of people and places and events, but if we really scrutinize it from a historical or archaeological perspective, we see that there are places like Mycenae. That's a real place mentioned in the Iliad. It was one of the major cities of the Mycenaean civilization. Troy was a real place. Heinrich Schliemann, those famous early archaeological excavations there. They even found that it was destroyed about the time that the Iliad says that war happened and the destruction of Troy. So maybe the event is reflected. But if we look at the characters themselves, there's no historical archaeological evidence for Achilles and for Hector and for Paris and all these different characters. Okay, so even though it's set in a real era and some real locations, it's still not a historical narrative. It's still mythology. And the difference between the Iliad and the Bible is that we do have the evidence for all these people that are named in the Bible who have the same name, the same title, the same occupation. They lived in the same place at the same time. And very often we even have situations where events or actions that are described in the Bible are corroborated by extra biblical evidence.
And so, again, I appreciate that because, as you pointed out, it is quite possible that we would certainly have some of these areas like those individuals or David and Isaiah or Sargon or Nebuchadnezzar or whatever, but those still could be mythological. So the reason I think this is such a significant book is you focus on some of those people and give us an opportunity to learn more. Again, you have more than 130 names. I picked out about 24 we might be able to get to, but I suspect probably will not get to all of those, but let's begin with an easy one, but one that I think surprises a lot of people, and that is David. I think most Americans, most Christians would think that we had historical evidence for David, yet you can go back a few decades even and find some people suggesting that, well, David was just a mythology of a good king and Saul was the bad king. So it was really a story of a bad king and a good king, but there really wasn't a David until we found some of the archaeological evidence. True?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The issue of David's existence and archaeological discoveries is one of the best examples for not only turning the tables on a skeptical narrative about the Bible or biblical figures, but also for scholars changing their minds when there is clear archaeological evidence presented.
And again, you have a couple pages on that, so I think it's very helpful. Need to take a break. We'll come back and continue our conversation today. Archaeology and the people of the Bible. We're privileged to have with us today Titus Kennedy. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Charles Cook has written a powerful essay with the title Against Misery. He's had enough of the long faces of Americans. We should have gratitude for what we enjoy and usually take for granted. He says a baby who is born in America today would have been envied by pretty much every other human being who came before. Without having done anything to earn it, that baby is the beneficiary of thousands of years' worth of other people's effort, experimentation, and pain. Now, he certainly understands that we face cultural, political, and economic challenges. The government is in debt with entitlement programs that are unaffordable. Our education system is producing students who can't read, write, count, or think straight. We have work to do in every area of life, but we should be grateful for what we have. His essay reminded me of a commentary I did 4 months ago based on the essay by Kelsey Piper. She reminds us that medieval kings would envy you. We live in a world of affluence that people in other centuries could not even imagine. She walks you through her house and counts 27 varieties of tea in a cupboard stuffed to the brim. She looks at her bookshelf and reflects on the fact that when the Library of Congress was founded, it had 740 books. She has more. She walks by glass windows, which were a luxury adornment for the homes of the ultra-wealthy since the time of Rome, though that's underselling modern windows because they weren't transparent back then. She also talks about her refrigerator and flush toilets. Both these essays remind us that we are rich beyond the dreams of people who have lived before us. Perhaps we should have more gratitude and look less miserable. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I mentioned that we also have a link to Discovery Institute, and you might want to know a little bit more, as we'll be talking about later this month, about the Story of Everything, which is a movie which is really based upon, again, some of the great work that is done there at the Discovery Institute, in particular Stephen Meyer, The Return to the God Hypothesis. And, of course, we will also be promoting that and, of course, talking about the book by John West about the very important aspect of America's 250th anniversary. So lots of great resources. So if you'd like to know more about Titus Kennedy or the Discovery Institute, that is available at our website at pointofview.net. We also would encourage you to look for this book in your local bookstore, but because it may be seen as more technical, it may or may not be in your bookstore. So we have a way in which you can get it in paperback or Kindle there as well. But I was just thinking for just a minute, Titus, as we were going to a break, you were, of course, talking about David and how that changed people's minds. We're going to get to the New Testament later, but you think about Luke in particular as historian, because Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, but also the book of Acts. How many times there were skeptics that said Luke didn't get historical facts correct, and now you have books like Colin Hermer's book, The Book of Acts, and the setting of Hellenistic history, and others documenting that on every particular statement he makes, the skeptics were wrong and the Bible was right. And that's one of the good news of all the great archaeological discoveries, both in the Old and New Testament, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was an interesting story of a scholar and archaeologist, Ramsey. He set out to actually disprove the book of Acts, Luke and Acts, and he was specifically really interested in Acts. And he thought that as he did more research and did more archaeological work, that he would find Luke messed up all sorts of details. But what he found was the opposite, that Luke was getting everything right, and he actually completely changed his perspective and worldview because of his archaeological findings.
Well, again, this discovery of this idea of the House of David at Tel Dan Steel, just very significant. And I thought I'd just keep moving, though, because when people think of the Old Testament, what about Ahab and Jezebel? Because we now know a lot more about them, and we even maybe know a little bit more about that orchard and all sorts of other things that are part of that story.
Yeah, we have attestation for both Ahab and even Jezebel, maybe surprisingly. So Ahab, he was the son of King Omri, so one of those two very famous wicked kings of the northern kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And he was quite a powerful king, although the Bible doesn't dedicate a huge amount of text to his reign. But he is attested as fighting battles against and with other kings. In particular, the Assyrians name him on one of the steles of Shalmaneser III, and they even say that he had the most chariots of any of these kings that was in a coalition fighting against the Assyrians. So he was quite powerful. He had apparently more chariots, a larger chariot force than other regional kings in his area. And excavations at Jezreel, they think that based on what they found inside this big fortress there, essentially a parking lot where they think that the chariot corps of Ahab would have been stored when not in use out in battle.
So again, we just have all sorts of different kinds of evidence. I might just point also to a very good piece that was in the Breakpoint commentary by our good friend John Stonestreet about some of that as well. But one of the things that we did a number of years ago, Titus, is we produced these small booklets. I'll hold it up right now. One of those, this was A Biblical View on Archaeology. I was looking at the date. First of all, it's 2019, so it's 7 years old. I am planning to update it so I can include your book in it and all sorts of findings. But even back then, we were beginning to find evidence of Isaiah because we found this bulla, or this particular section, which gives us the idea that indeed this was talking about an Isaiah that could indeed be the prophet of Isaiah, found at the same kind of layers where we also find information about Hezekiah. So what do we know about that? Because that's a very significant find as well, isn't it?
That was, and I think that sent some shockwaves through both academia and the public, because Isaiah is one of the most, if not the most famous Old Testament prophet, and yet before this discovery, we had no evidence outside of the Bible for his existence. Of course, we've got the great Isaiah scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you might argue is some evidence for him, although it's hundreds of years later. But excavations in Jerusalem uncovered this impression from a seal, the seal of Isaiah, and it said on it,
right,
Isaiah the prophet in Hebrew. And it was found right in the same area as another seal impression of King Hezekiah, who he served under. So this is, I think, very, very strong evidence for Isaiah and his role as the prophet under the rule of Hezekiah, just like we read about in the Bible.
And again, one of the things I do when I speak on this, not claiming to be an archaeologist like you, but certainly enough to be dangerous, is that King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah are mentioned together 17 times. So finding that at the same section in this particular seal, very, very significant. By contrast, we seem to know a lot about Isaiah, not as much about Jeremiah, but you have a chapter about that as well.
Yeah, that's right. So Jeremiah, who, maybe he's the second most famous prophet, certainly very prominent, wrote 2 books. And we have, first of all, his scribe, Baruch, who is mentioned in the Bible. We have his seal impression that's been found. And why we can say it was him is because on it reads, Baruch, son of Neriah, the scribe. So it gives us his name, his family lineage, and his occupation, and it comes from the region of Jerusalem. It wasn't excavated, we're not exactly sure, but somewhere around the area, and it by typography, it dates to about the 7th century BC. But Jeremiah himself may even be named in what are called the Lachish Ostraca, or the Lachish letters.
Mm-hmm.
So these were written between the commander at Lachish and Jerusalem around the time that Nebuchadnezzar's army was attacking Judah. And it mentions the prophet in more than one of the letters. And of course, Jeremiah was really the only true prophet in Judah at that time. But we also have what appears to be the name Jeremiah there. Mm-hmm. Now, I say appears because these letters were written in ink on pottery, and some of the ink is very faded, so we can't see every single letter, but it does appear to be the name Jeremiah. So it's quite possible that we have Jeremiah and his scribe attested as well.
Let me, if I can, for just a minute, then maybe talk about people that aren't part of the narrative, but were very important. And years ago, we actually covered a very interesting story that came out in which it said ISIS accidentally corroborates the Bible. It turns out that the ISIS terrorists who were in Mosul, which is, of course, where the ancient city of Nineveh is, or was, they uncovered the remains of the Assyrian palace of Esarhaddon, who you refer to. And so you have a whole section here about Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and so many of those Assyrians, which were, of course, coming against Israel, are all very well documented as well, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are kings of what at the time was the most powerful empire in the ancient world, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And so we should expect to find things like that. But when you find corroboration of specific events that are recorded in the Bible about those Assyrian kings, or even in their own records, they record mention of some of the kings of Israel and Judah. That's a little bit surprising, but very interesting. And then, of course, if you go back farther in time to the early days of archaeology, there were actually many scholars who questioned whether Sargon was even a real king, because he was mentioned in Isaiah chapter 20, but we didn't have any archaeological evidence for him. And now he's one of the better known and attested Assyrian kings.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend a little more time in the Old Testament. Let's look at maybe Nebuchadnezzar. The other day we were talking about Cyrus, so I thought that would be good, maybe Darius. Then we'll get into the New Testament. What about, of course, you hear people say all the time, do we have any evidence of Jesus? Well, yes, we do. How about Pontius Pilate? Well, we have his ring, or at least a ring with his name is on it, and, of course, a name on a place at Caesarea Maritima and much other places. But what about James and Peter and others? So I think we will certainly go through just a few of the very important names that show up in the Bible, which are attested to by archaeology. We'll continue that right after this.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Titus Kennedy, again, author of a previous book, Unearthing the Bible. The one we're talking about, though, right now is Archaeology and the People of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. And I thought, Titus, for just a minute, we might explain how each one of the chapters is put together. And I'll use Nebuchadnezzar as a good example, because you have the name, you have the time period, the geographical area, then the various places that it is referred to, where he in this case referred to 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then you talk about the various sources, everything from the Ishtar Gate and the cylinders of Nebuchadnezzar, the Tower of Babel steel, and then, of course, a final identification rating, and you give it an A through whatever, and in this case, A, very firm. And this is a good illustration that anybody that would question the existence of Nebuchadnezzar, and I can't imagine anybody really would, they've got to deal with a lot of different archaeological finds, not just in the Middle East, but all the way in England, too. And so in some respects, we can establish the timeline and the activities, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, probably no one's going to be questioning the existence of Nebuchadnezzar, but What a study like this can do for a person like Nebuchadnezzar is just show where he connects to with the biblical narrative and some of the specifics of that. Things like Daniel, the book of Daniel, where he talks about he built Babylon, and then we can see from archaeological sources where Nebuchadnezzar himself claims he built this and that, and some of the buildings that have been excavated. Also, how long did he reign? So we can kind of see the timeline of what's going on through the book of Daniel, which is covers quite a number of years, decades. And so this is something that can really help, I think, fill out the historical context of narratives like the book of Daniel and Second Kings, as well as corroborate some of the littler details.
I would certainly say that those of you that are Bible teachers are those who want to get into any kind of investigative Bible study. You'll find this so helpful because then it brings together all sorts of different pieces that maybe you have not been able to pull together as you are focusing on a particular passage, either to teach it or to study it yourself. But let me move on to Cyrus II, because we were talking about Cyrus the other day, in part because some people refer to President Trump as Cyrus, but more importantly, reminding the Jewish people, because even various leaders in, for example, Israel, like Benjamin Netanyahu, talk about Cyrus. And again, there is an individual that you have a firm number A rating on, because we have everything from the Cyrus cylinder. I'd love to have you talk about that, various inscriptions, as well as various historical accounts like from Herodotus and others. So again, we can establish with great certainty Cyrus II.
Yeah, Cyrus is another one of these extremely well-known and well-documented kings, and so people aren't really going to be arguing over did he exist, because he's so well-known outside of the Bible. But as you point out, the Cyrus cylinder, that's a very important artifact. And in terms of looking at the historical narrative of the Bible, one of the reasons the Cyrus cylinder is so important is because it essentially gives us the Babylonian version of what we read at the beginning of the book of Ezra. That is when the Babylonians are conquered and Cyrus comes in and he says to all these different people, you can go home now. And specifically, he tells the Jews, you can go back to your land, back to Jerusalem, and you can bring the things that were looted from the temple back with you. And of course, they end up rebuilding the temple. But the Cyrus cylinder is targeted more towards Babylon. And so it mentions Marduk instead of Yahweh, but it also talks about letting all these exiled peoples go back to their homes and bringing their religious objects with them. So that corroborates this specific command or decree that we find there in the Bible.
All right. In Second Chronicles and Ezra, as you mentioned, Isaiah, Daniel, all are there. One other one I thought, and then we'll move to the New Testament, and that's Darius. And the reason for that, again, is that you have, again, a firm established idea. But more importantly, you have actual tablets. You have an inscribed golden bowl of Darius. And so as you go through the Old Testament, you begin to realize we can actually find very firm points at which we know these individuals were in existence. We know their chronology. We know when they were. We know what was happening at that general time. And then when you put the Bible next to it, it matches up perfectly.
Absolutely. And in fact, the Old Testament has more than one Darius mentioned in it. Darius the first, who you were just talking about,
right,
the Great, and Darius the second, who is mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. So we've got those distinctions. We've got the archaeological evidence for both of them, their time periods, their interactions, even in cases with things in the biblical text.
Well, we can go to the New Testament. Everybody's waiting for that anyway, I suspect. And the first one you talk about is Herod. Again, firmly established for a lot of reasons. Herod the First, so-called Herod the Great. We have a coin. We have the sarcophagus. We have all sorts of historical references. We have Josephus in particular. So coins, history, everything establishes that Herod indeed existed, and that's no real surprise to us.
Yeah, but I think something that might be a surprise to people is that if we read Matthew, we see the so-called massacre of the innocents, and people wonder, okay, why is that only mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, or why is that not mentioned in Josephus? Did it really happen? But if we look into Josephus and we look into the details of Herod's life, what we find is that near the end of his life, especially, I mean, he was violent prior to this, but near the end of his life, he starts going on a rampage because he is paranoid about losing his power. You know, he heard about Jesus. He didn't want to be replaced as king, but he even killed some of his own sons in the last 3 years of his life because he was paranoid that they were going to try to take his throne. So we see how historically the profile of Herod fits absolutely perfectly, even with little passages like we have in Matthew that might seem odd to some critics.
We're getting into some other Herods as well, Antipas and Agrippa, but I thought for one, we might go to Pontius Pilate, because anybody that goes on a tour to Israel, and we've done this many times, you go to Caesarea Maritima, and they show a stone. Actually, it's a reconstruction because the original is, of course, in the museum in Jerusalem, but in that stone, it has Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. So for somebody to say, well, I don't think there was a Pontius Pilate, we have that. And if that's not enough, I did mention this in our booklet years ago, that they had discovered a ring over in the Herodium, which is over kind of closer really to Bethlehem, but they eventually developed the technology enough to read that it had the name Pontius Pilate on the ring. Now, I don't think it was one that he had. I think it was probably one that was used by a Roman official to show that he had the authority of Pontius Pilate. But here we have, again, numerous archaeological evidence of the existence of Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, we do. And that ring's sort of an interesting story, but because it was found decades ago. In fact, it was found even excavated slightly before the Pilate stone was, but it was never cleaned and examined until recently. But you look at the Pilate stone, that's in Latin, and then you look at this ring, and it's in Greek, and it's spelled exactly the same way as Pilate's name is in the Greek New Testament. So another great find, but also tells us that sometimes in archaeology things are discovered and then no one actually pays attention to them and examines them until many years later. So there's a lot out there waiting to be discovered and uncovered.
That means, if nothing else, for you, that's job security. There's always more to find, if nothing else.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break, and we'll come back, and let's talk about the obvious one. That is Jesus of Nazareth, and you've got some great material there. If we have time, we'll maybe talk about James. And just for our trip that we take to Corinth, we had to do Erastus. So we'll get into a couple of those examples in just a minute. But again, if you find yourself saying, okay, I didn't know archaeology could be that interesting, and I didn't realize all these pictures and diagrams and manuscripts and everything. So again, we are encouraging you, if you are interested at all in this, or maybe we've piqued your interest, take the time to click on the button there that actually has information about the book, and it's a way in which you can get it either in paperback or Kindle. It's published by our good friends at Harvest House. If you can find it in your local bookstore, great, but if not, we've made it a way that you can obtain it as well. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about archaeology and the people of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. Titus Kennedy is our guest, and we need to, of course, go to Jesus of Nazareth. And we have so many different sources. When people sometimes say, well, I can't even believe that Jesus lived. Really? I mean, we have all sorts of historical sources, and you spend a full paragraph just going through those. Then you have all sorts of other issues as well. You have the so-called Jesus cup. I want you to explain that in just a minute. Jesus the magician. You have the ossuary of James that mentions Jesus' name. And you just, every time you turn around, you have one other reference, either historical reference or archaeological find that points back to Jesus. But take us through a few of those, because it is, I think, encouraging to see how many different kinds of sources we have for Jesus.
Sure. So Jesus in pop culture is sometimes said to have been this legendary figure who maybe he existed, but we don't have historical evidence for him. But in the academic world, no professional scholar in archaeology or ancient history believes that. Everyone knows that he is one of the better attested people from antiquity. And as you mentioned, some of those historical references, I mean, we've got 5 people who lived in the first century who wrote and mentioned Jesus. That's Josephus, Serapion, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Suetonius. And then you asked about that cup. This is a really interesting artifact. It's a fairly new find in terms of archaeological discoveries. It was discovered, less than 20 years ago, but it really hasn't gotten much press or publication. But it was a cup, ceramic cup, that was found in the ancient harbor of Alexandria, Egypt. And this cup has a Greek inscription on it that says, "Through Christ the magician," dates to the first century. So it's using the title Christ. And if we go to a couple of other ancient references, we see that many people, especially in Egypt, thought of Jesus as some kind of magician. He performed miracles, and so Egypt was very into magic, and that was their explanation. The Egyptian magical papyri, they say that one of the ways that you cast out demons is by invoking the name of Jesus, God of the Hebrews. Kind of reminds me of Acts, book of Acts in Ephesus.
Right.
And then also you go to Celsus in the 2nd century, and he's actually a critic of Christianity. But he says that when Jesus was in Egypt as a young child, he learned magic, and then he went back to Judea and performed all these miracles and proclaimed himself God. So that is how people, in some contexts, thought of Jesus, as a magician. And so this cup seems to be attesting to that, and his title, Christ.
Well, and again, the other part of that, and this kind of ties into James, because we then have an ossuary. People would be buried, and then later they would take their bones and put them in what's a box or an ossuary. And on the side, it has James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, which, again, if indeed we assume that is if you will, the half-brother of Jesus, James, one of the disciples, you have that actually as an inscription on the ossuary.
Right. So I would say this, first of all, is that Josephus mentions James as the brother of Jesus. So this is a well-known association. But what's really unique about this ossuary inscription is that if you go and you review all the various ossuary inscriptions of this period, you will find that they will give the name of the deceased, and then oftentimes the name of their father, or the name of their occupation, or perhaps the city or region where they're from. But you almost never have the brother name. In fact, only one other inscription names the brother. But this one names the father and the brother. The brother's tacked on to the end there, suggesting that he was someone very important and notable, that they wanted to include that additional mention. And a statistical study was done using these names, the percentage of their use in first century Jerusalem and the population there, and came to the determination that this Jesus could fit less than 2 people statistically. So it's almost certainly talking about Jesus Christ, and we really have no evidence that it would be anybody else. We don't know of any other name associations like that.
Let me just pick one other one, just kind of fun, because when we take people to Greece, when you go to Corinth, of course, you pull up on the bus and everybody sees all the columns and everything, and we first take them down this little path, looks like a goat path almost, and people are wondering, where are we going? And we take them to an inscription that actually was a part of pavement outside of the city, and it has the name Erastus. Now, a lot of people go, well, why is that important? Well, it turns out that if you go to the book of Acts, you see that Paul had individuals with him, and Timothy, everybody knows who he is, but the other one was Erastus, but we didn't have any evidence of him until we find this inscription and find out that he was like a city manager or something of that nature. And so here, just one of those puzzles in the book of Acts, you can find in something as simple as an inscription that was uncovered years ago, and illustrates again that the Bible was accurate, and Luke was accurately recording our history right there in the book of Acts.
Yeah, that one's one of my favorites. I love to go and visit and see that inscription, and it's just pretty incredible that one of these minor characters who Paul mentions, and of course he gives his name and he gives his title and he tells us where he's situated there in Corinth. So we've got a great identification for Erastus, one of the companions of Paul.
So we maybe did 20 out of the 130. That's pretty good, but if nothing else, that's a reason for you to get a copy of the book. It is entitled Archaeology and the People of the Bible, Exploring the Evidence for the Historical Existence of Bible Characters. And Titus, I thought for just a minute, we might just encourage people to contact you. Certainly the best way to do it. We have one link there to the Discovery Institute. That's probably a good way to contact you, but I suspect you would be available to come and speak on this book. Maybe teach in classes and things of that nature. So if people have questions or would like to maybe ask you about an archaeological discovery they've read about, they can do so, can't they?
Yeah. Inquire through Discovery Institute, and I do occasionally go speak at different conferences and seminars, and occasionally in other classrooms as well, although I've got quite a few of my own classes to teach.
But again, we appreciate the work that you're doing in that regard, and I just think that if nothing else, as I've said before, the fact that we have all these books coming out this year on archaeology illustrate again that we just have a wealth of evidence, and that should be encouraging to all our believers. And since we do so much in theology and apologetics, I certainly know that we're going to do a future updated booklet on archaeology, and we'll certainly include your book and other references to it as well. So appreciate you giving us some time today, and thank you for joining us on Point of View.
Hey, and thank you for having me.
Again, the book is entitled Archaeology and the People of the Bible, and that is one of many books. I know we have one on the Jesus discoveries coming up in about 2 weeks with our good friend Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, and I know Paul Weaver has a book coming out. And this, I think, just illustrates again that we are living in this golden age of archaeology, so we should be encouraged. Going to take a break. Let me just mention, some of you wondered how we were doing with our finances. We now have crossed the 2/3 level. We'd like to actually reach our goal, but if nothing else, we appreciate those of you that helped. If you still want to call, of course, you can give us a call at 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Got a lot to cover. We'll do that in the next hour, right after this.
If we want to see America's godly heritage restored, we have to embolden everyday Americans to stand up for truth. And we all need to do our part. At Point of View, we are doing our part daily to provide trustworthy information and the biblical perspective that people need to make sense of our world. But we cannot do that without you. Last week, as you probably know, Point of View highlighted the incredible impact of Truth Team supporters, those who make Point of View possible, and we had a goal of raising $150,000 in 7 days. Being very honest with you, we came up short of that goal, but you can still help us get there. Take a moment right now to make a difference for the nation and for our future. Give today by visiting pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we'll spend some time, if we can, looking at a couple of issues. One, of course, the president gave an address last night about Iran, and I have a piece by William Galston, who wouldn't necessarily be a Trump supporter, but I think gives us a clear analysis of kind of what is next and what could happen next. We, of course, have 4 astronauts headed towards the moon. And I have a piece by Charles Cook, Against Misery, the Moonshot edition. Interestingly enough, because I've posted today my commentary about his previous commentary on Against Misery, so we'll put those together in just a few minutes. But let's, if we can, recognize that, as I mentioned yesterday, if you were listening, Victor Davis Hanson says, when you talk about a war, there's 2 wars. There's the military war and there's the political war. Last night, the president had to address the political war because, after all, if the American people are not behind you, and at the moment, not as many are as in previous entrees into the Middle East, that can go wrong very quickly. Even if people are with you, what is so striking is how fickle and how impatient people can be. American people, I'll talk about in a minute, but just think about the British people. Who led Great Britain through World War II? Winston Churchill. What happened afterwards? He's out of office. You can go to America and use a more recent example. You have Desert Storm. George Herbert Walker Bush had a popularity during that military campaign that was almost off the charts, almost unprecedented, and then he loses in 1992. So you have to recognize that even if people are on your side, there are certainly a lot of reasons for people to be upset about your policies or to maybe not transfer their enthusiasm for a military campaign for domestic policy. But in this case, not everybody's been on board with what is happening in Iran, to put it mildly. And the American people are going to, for some time, face some very significant challenges. Near the end of the program, I'll try to give you a list of just some of the things that have happened economically already because of our war in Iran. Now, the bottom line is some of those are short-lived, some of them are not. And so that is certainly the case. So that's why I thought this piece by William Galston, who actually served in the Clinton administration, would be a good opportunity to hear from him. He now holds the chair at the Brookings Institute, which is a little bit more left of center, but I think this was a good way to have somebody who is not necessarily a cheerleader for Donald Trump to address some of the issues. Here's how he says it. He says, more than a month into the war with Iran, President Trump now faces the most consequential decision of his presidency. What is that? Whether to deploy U.S. ground troops on Iranian territory. Now, he is certainly geared up for the possibility, but what will happen next? And he goes on to say, that is William Galston goes on to say, look, he's trying to reject both sides. Patriotic cheerleading is worse than useless. So is defeatism, as well as seat-of-the-pants policymaking. He says we need a cool-headed assessment of our options and the Iranians' possible responses. And so he's calling for what he calls epistemological humility. Those are kind of the big words we use in graduate his school, but basically we need just to have a little bit of humility about what is true and what is not. And he says, first of all, the immediate problem, and I think we all know this, is Iran's seizure of the Strait of Hormuz. We've tried to explain a little of that last week, even during the Truth Team week, because that has enabled the Iranians to block ships of countries they view as hostile and then impose transit fees on others. I talked about the other day that India's oil was let through because they were willing to pay Chinese yuan for that. But you have now the possibility of more than 20 countries have said that they are ready to help ensure safe passage through the strait, but many of them really would be, I think, hesitant to enter an active war zone. In just a minute, that's going to get to our second piece that I've posted here, which is the interview that was done with Secretary of State Marco Rubio about how NATO has really been dragging their feet and not even opening up some of the bases. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So, William Galston, again, I appreciate his fairness, quotes from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. That's a group that is probably better known for having what you might say a hawkish kind of viewpoint, the use of military might. But again, even they argue, he says, that if you were to have Donald Trump take Karg Island, and by the way, we have a picture of that on this article if you'd like to see what that looks like, where that is. That's an island where, of course, much of the oil is actually deployed to many of these tankers. But nevertheless, he said if indeed this was the case, taking the island could be a trap of America's own making, because indeed, if indeed a Karg Island mission makes sense, it would be that it would could possibly strike a decisive blow, shorten the war, and secure our strategic interests. So that's one possibility. Of course, the other possibility is that Donald Trump, as he was certainly sounding last night, might just simply at one point declare victory, draw down American troops and say, we did what we planned to do. That is, we took out the nuclear facilities for now. They still may have the uranium, but we're not going to risk going in and trying to get it. We have taken out their Navy. We've taken out their Air Force. They are no longer the threat in the Middle East that they were before. They could do that. But if indeed you wanted to protect the shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, well, then General Clark, that would be Wesley Clark, points out in one op-ed that was in USA Today that in order to do that, you'd have to not only deploy troops in the water, the Navy, but along the shoreline and maybe even the airspace above. That's quite a very significant advancement of what is really being done right now by the Trump administration. So, again, William Galston ends by saying the prospects for negotiating a reopening of the strait and ending the war are dismal. There's no guarantee that force could accomplish what diplomacy cannot. And so this is why he says President Trump faces some difficult choices. If the war ends with Iran still in control of the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. will have suffered a strategic defeat. But on the other hand, ground forces don't necessarily guarantee success. So if you haven't been praying for the president and the Secretary of State, you might think about doing so, because as he points out, America faces perhaps its toughest choice now. It was one thing to go in. It was one thing to obliterate, the word that was used the other night by the president, the various military forces of Iran. It's quite another to talk about whether or not we deploy ground troops and the possible fallout that could have, of course, to the midterms and the political areas as well. So let's take a break. When we come back, a few other comments about NATO, because for the very first time, you're having the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's always been a supporter of NATO, say, we haven't exactly received the kind of support we were expecting from them. Why are we part of NATO if they won't help us? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Charles Cook has written a powerful essay with the title Against Misery. He's had enough of the long faces of Americans. We should have gratitude for what we enjoy and usually take for granted. He says a baby who is born in America today would have been envied by pretty much every other human being who came before. Without having done anything to earn it, that baby is the beneficiary of thousands of years' worth of other people's effort, experimentation, and pain. Now, he certainly understands that we face cultural, political, and economic challenges. The government is in debt with entitlement programs that are unaffordable. Our education system is producing students who can't read, write, count, or think straight. We have work to do in every area of life, but we should be grateful for what we have. His essay reminded me of a commentary I did 4 months ago based on the essay by Kelsey Piper. She reminds us that medieval kings would envy you. We live in a world of affluence that people in other centuries could not even imagine. She walks you through her house and counts 27 varieties of tea in a cupboard stuffed to the brim. She looks at her bookshelf and reflects on the fact that when the Library of Congress was founded, it had 740 books. She has more. She walks by glass windows, which were a luxury adornment for the homes of the ultra-wealthy since the time of Rome, though that's underselling modern windows because they weren't transparent back then. She also talks about her refrigerator and flush toilets. Both these essays remind us that we are rich beyond the dreams of people who have lived before us. Perhaps we should have more gratitude and look less miserable. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, while we talk about this war with Iran, there has been an issue on the side which I wanted to focus on, and that is our second article, Why Are We in NATO? Marco Rubio. He was asked on a talk show recently, what about this? Because if you have not been paying attention, it turns out that some of our countries we've been somewhat disappointed with, Great Britain, France, Spain, Italy, for example, because they have not allowed American troops to land there or refuel. And so Marco Rubio, who's our Secretary of State, said, look, I've been one of the strongest defenders of NATO during my time as U.S. Senator because I found great value in it. And it wasn't just about defending Europe. I said it allowed us to have military bases in Europe that allowed us to project power into different parts of the world when our national security was threatened. If now we have reached a point, he says, where the NATO alliance means we can't use those bases, that in fact we can no longer use those bases to defend America's interests, then he says, NATO's become kind of a one-way street. Then NATO is simply about us having troops in Europe to defend Europe, but when we need their help, they're not there because they just simply would not allow us to use their military bases. And so that's why Marco Rubio says, why are we in NATO? He says we have billions and billions of dollars, really hundreds of billions of dollars over the years and trillions of dollars, and all these American forces stationed in the region. And if we can only use them in our time of need so that when they want them, we're not going to be allowed to use their bases, there's the problem. So when they need us, we have to be there. But when we need them, no, you can't even land your planes there, which just is amazing to me. And so, again, in the midst of that, he was pointing out that, okay, we're achieving many of our objectives there in Iran, but one of the things that's sort of in the background, and you're now hearing other United States senators say that, watched another one last night on a talk show, say, I'm going to rethink about how many troops we want to deploy in some of these NATO bases in Europe and other places there as well. And so that's where he kind of winds down, in which Marco Rubio says, we're going to have to re-examine whether or not this alliance that has served this country well for a while is still serving that purpose, or if it's now become a one-way street where America is simply in a position to defend Europe, but then when we need help from our allies, they're going to deny us basing rights and not even allow us to fly over them. So, there's what's called overflight. So you can read the entire piece, but it is some of the fallout that people maybe didn't see coming, and yet is one other aspect of how this war in Iran has affected alliances and even the strategic balance of power, not only in the Middle East, but also even in Europe as well. But I thought for just a few minutes we might talk about the moonshot. And this piece by Charles Cook is very good. He says, as a child, I was obsessed with the American space program. If you're not familiar, he's British, which, along with the country's unparalleled collection of roller coasters, was one of the many things that initially attracted me to the United States and convinced me that it was better than everywhere else. One of the reasons, I guess, he came from Great Britain to the United States was the space program and roller coasters. Who knew? Anyway, the bottom line is one of the things that he found very troubling early on is we all remember some of the early missions, but he said later on, and we're talking about Apollo 15, Apollo 16, Apollo 17. Those of us that are older might remember those. The general public wasn't all that interested. And he said, I was kind of astonished, even annoyed, because, of course, nothing was going to beat Apollo 11, landing on the moon, first man to step on the moon, or even Apollo 13, the disaster that unfolded, and everybody's holding their breath, and, of course, movies done about both of those. But he said the best I came up with was by 1971 and 1972, Apollo 11 had been recent. Amazing, yes, but amazing couple of years, and humans are impatient, complacent, and easily bored, and the moon landing was so 1960s, and so they went on. So he says, but what can explain the indifference now? By the way, he wrote this a few days ago, but I did notice quite a number of people paying attention to the launch. One of the people we had in as our guest here, Parker Ing, was right there when it was taking off, and I saw a variety of other people. Glenn Beck, I saw the piece there where he's crying after the launch, but still, a lot of people are going, oh, going back to the moon, ho hum, ho hum. And of course, they're not going to the moon this time, they're only orbiting it, he points out. But nevertheless, this is something that should really energize individuals. I think that it might, but nevertheless, I think this is just something to see. And he says, look, does anybody care? He says, I'm fully aware that I cannot tell people what they should be interested in. But again, he's just sort of surprised that in some respects, we're just sort of taking everything for granted. And so that's why what he does is refer back to his particular article, his commentary on Against Misery, which, by the way, is my commentary today, in which he points out that he made a plea against misery in that piece, in which he said it is, of course, virtuous for free people to attempt to improve the country they inherited, but it's a grave mistake, he says, to believe that anything short of the establishment of heaven on earth represents failure. What we have in the United States right now is not a matter of if or when or after or before, but right now is a, as he says, miracle. It is, of course, the economy, the culture, the constitutional order. And in my piece today about Against Misery, he's got a great quote in which he says, look, a baby born in America today would have been envied by pretty much every other human being who came before. Without having done anything to earn it, that baby is the beneficiary of thousands of years' worth of other people's effort, experimentation, and pain. And in my commentary, I remind you of a piece that I talked about earlier by Kelsey Piper, in which she actually said that medieval kings would envy you, and goes through all the benefits that we enjoy today that, quite frankly, we take for granted. So I think there's really a place for gratitude, and one aspect of that is just the fact that we can put people in a spaceship and launch them not just around the Earth, but very soon they're going to come out of that elliptical orbit and head towards the moon again. And human eyes will see the backside of the moon, first time in 50 years, all sorts of things that are going to come from that. And eventually we're going to have people on the moon again. Pretty amazing. So anyway, he says, look, in the year of our Lord 2026, the United States is no such thing. In fact, it is the best place in the world by far. It has a durable constitutional order that more than 2 centuries since it was ratified continues to protect individual rights to an extent that remains unique in the West. It is the largest and most dynamic economy and the highest standard of living of any large nation. It has the most impressive higher education sector, the best scientists, engineers, and doctors, and the lion's share of the global technology industry. It boasts massive natural resources, including enough oil to remain energy independent, vast tracts of arable land, and an abundant fresh water. It has the most fearsome military, the world's reserve currency, and the most important financial markets on earth. To which he adds, and we're going to the moon, which I love. So if nothing else, just a reminder that let's not be too, commonplace about some of this. The piece that I posted there just reminds us of the fact that we are in many ways incredibly blessed. Anyone born into this country or even into the modern world is enjoying things that would be completely unimaginable to people in previous centuries. And even the example I used from Kelsey Piper, she says, just even as I walk through my room, I look and there's 27 varieties of tea in my cupboard filled to the brim. I see a bookshelf and reflect on the fact that the Library of Congress, when it was founded, had 740 books. I have more. She talks about glass windows he walks by, which were a luxury adornment for the homes of the ultra-wealthy since the time of Rome. But she says that's really underselling modern windows because these in the past weren't transparent like ours. She talks about a refrigerator. She talks about flush toilets. She talks about so many different things. And if nothing else, whether it's Kelsey Piper or Charles Cook, maybe it's time for just a little bit of gratitude, especially during this Holy Week as we go to, of course, Good Friday tomorrow. I'll have some comments about that at the end of the program, but when we come back, still have a very contentious debate in Congress, which we'll talk about. Do we still have a shutdown? We do at the moment. What's the future? We'll talk about that right after this.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support, please. Join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you had to fly recently, you know what it is like to be in the airports where the problem has been going from bad to worse in terms of TSA. And so we will spend a little bit of time talking about this piece by Byron York on what he called the insane shutdown and will it ever end. There is an attempt right now to come up with some agreement between the Republican leader in the Senate, John Thune, Moon, and the Speaker of the House, that would be Mike Johnson. And up until recently, there were differences, I think rather significant differences of agreement or disagreement. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But I had to smile a little bit because these incredibly long waits at some of these airports, because of what's now been almost a 50-day partial shutdown, has really put some of the travelers in a very bad mood. Angry mood would be another sense. So in Houston, one man thought, well, maybe the way I can cheer people up, as he was walking up and down the security line with a vodka bottle, pouring shots for annoyed adults. Don't recommend it, but it just made me laugh to think about this. In Atlanta, the airport there was an individual that plays the violin, and he was, again, playing the violin up and down the security line, which then had one passenger say, didn't they play the violin on the deck of the Titanic when it was going down? So obviously there are attempts to try to lighten the demeanor, probably a nice way to put this, in these long lines, because TSA, who didn't do anything wrong, nevertheless found themselves once again dealing with a shutdown. Can you imagine, and I imagine most of our listeners cannot imagine, what it would be like to go 4 weeks without getting a paycheck? And you can see that some of them said they were just recovering from the shutdown that happened before. And so Byron York says, does this make any sense? Because you have the argument being made right now in the Senate by the Senate Minority Leader, Charles Schumer, that in order to honor the memory of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, those are the two individuals who died at the hands of ICE, and we can go into what was justified or not justified, it's not important, but that justification for holding back funding of the Department of Homeland Security has put the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration workers, in a terrible bind. And the argument which was made at the time, and I'm quoting Chuck Schumer, is, in the wake of the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, Senate Democrats were clear, no blank check for lawless ICE and Border Patrol. And he goes on to say that, Schumer says, that we are standing united, which means we're standing united to make sure that we're not going to allow anybody in Homeland Security to be funded. And, of course, now they're trying to come up with some alternatives by which we fund all our part of Homeland Security, or we'll fund part of ICE or part of TSA. And again, one of the comments that was made off air was, well, how is it that ICE came in there if they weren't getting funded either? Well, it turns out, and I don't want to get too much into the deep weeds here, you don't really want to know how you make sausage there in Congress. Some of that funding for ICE comes from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that actually funds it in the future. So you had a situation where some of the ICE agents were funded when TSA was not and Border Protection was not. So I won't go into the details, but the point is simply this. Some 50,000 TSA airport officials across the country found their paychecks stopped simply because the Democrats, and in particular Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, were unhappy with another agency's enforcement of federal immigration law. And I think, again, as he points out, this situation is stupid for a number of reasons. And let me just count them down fairly quickly. First, he says the Trump administration actually agreed to some of the changes to ICE operations that the Democrats demanded in the first place. So if you were looking for progress, guess what? You had some progress actually being made if you were one of those individuals. And we've talked about this around the table before. The fact that we believe in deportation doesn't mean we accept every way in which deportation was done. But first of all, many of the particular changes that were being demanded by the Democrats actually were going to be implemented. But that was not enough. Second, significant parts of the ICE enforcement operations were already funded, as I mentioned just a minute ago, because of the at least the Big Beautiful Bill. Just the way the Big Beautiful Bill was written, they actually have funded ICE to 2029, if you can believe that, but I'll leave that for another day. Number three, he says the Democrats' strategy was particularly cruel because the Homeland Security employees that were defunded were still recovering from their 6-week Democrat-led shutdown last fall. There are some people here that were pointing out that there were a few civilian support staffers that haven't been paid for almost half of their last 6 months when you factor in the prior shutdown. So this wasn't just something that has lasted nearly 50 weeks. It was the second, if you will, slap in the face of those individuals from the previous shutdown. And number four, in an effort to escape the political blame for setting off huge lines at the airports across the country, Democrats proposed to fund TSA agents while still not paying those long-suffering professional and civilian support staff at Homeland Security and Border Patrol. So he points out that there are four very good reasons why this was a really bad idea. I hope that this is one time in which voters have a long memory. I really hope so. Voters tend to have a very short memory, and what happens in November will not be probably affected by what happened in March and April. But I'm hoping some people remember these shutdowns have come from the Democrats. They haven't come from the Republicans. And then, of course, Byron York then turns his concern and questions and criticism to the Republicans because he says the Republicans made a big mistake by trying to negotiate, because we've learned that oftentimes the winner in these shutdowns is the party that says no. And instead, the Republicans agreed to negotiate with the Democrats. And so now we get into these back and forth kinds of statements being made. And so again, as he concludes his piece, he says, look, as it goes, Chuck Schumer talking about the memory of these two individuals is the justification for doing what has been affecting not only TSA agents, but all the people that have had to travel through, in some cases, spring break and other certain and very essential travel. And as a result, the violence, he says, in Minnesota was not a legitimate cause for one party to lash out wildly, imposing punishment on, of all things, the nation's air travelers and the people who keep the air system safe. What sense does that make? And so, again, the push right now is to come up with some kind of bill where there is agreement. The other day, the Senate came up with a sort of milquetoast bill, kind of a generic, vaguely worded bill that was going to provide some funding. It landed over in the House, and to his credit, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson said, this thing's a joke. I mean, we're not getting any further down the road. And so now they're willing to go with a second version of that bill, which even some people are saying maybe it's just time to force the issue the other way around and to have the House pass something that fully funds ICE and Homeland Security at its entirety and get past this shutdown. But nevertheless, we are finding ourselves, as we're coming into, of course, the Easter break, no resolution of a shutdown that has lasted almost 50 days. And I think it would be appropriate for some of the voters to pay attention to who voted to keep funding people in the government and who voted not to fund people in the government. In many cases, you can oftentimes say, okay, we heard what you said. We think there's some changes that need to be made. We're willing to make those. Now let's stop the shutdown. Nope, we're not going to stop the shutdown until you do everything we want. And that is an illustration of why many people, whether it's the funding of Homeland Security or one of the other pieces of legislation we've been talking about for some time, the SAVE Act, which again stands for the Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility Act, why many people are saying maybe we should rethink whether or not to shut down the filibuster. We've given you the pros and cons for it, but you can see the level of frustration in Congress that is continuing as we're going into this Easter break. Let's take a break. We'll come back with some final comments right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought for a minute just to talk about some of the reality of what we're going to face. Of course, we talked about gratitude, and even as we go through some of these percentages, you might just again say, I'm so grateful I live in the United States. Because as we pointed out, the Strait of Hormuz, we've got, I think, during the first 23 days of March, 138 crossings, usually thousands are taking place. So again, that has dropped down dramatically, and that is still an issue front and center. And because of that, let's look at some of these numbers. The price of heating oil increased 77%. The price of European natural gas up 71%. Now, just to put that in perspective, the price of U.S. natural gas up 6%. So you can see that we benefit by the fact that we don't have to get our natural gas from, in many places in the Middle East. We have our own. But just imagine living in Europe right now, the cost of natural gas up 71%. Crude oil up 58%. I just checked it a minute ago. About $110 a barrel. But you've got to recognize that before this war with Iran, it was $70 a barrel. It was high of $126 a barrel, so we'll see where that is. Some of the others I mentioned, of course, fertilizer up 29%, and that is of concern because we have to grow crops. We probably can produce enough fertilizer here in this country, but in other countries, that's going to be dependent upon fertilizer, urea, and a number of other things. And some of that comes from Russia, but they're not exporting anymore. Some of that comes from the Middle East, but a lot of that has been tied up. The price of diesel up 44%, sulfur 43%, on and on. You can begin to recognize that we're in a difficult time, and I suspect some people may not necessarily be thinking about gratitude when they come to vote in these primaries and these midterm elections. They'll just be thinking about the price of gasoline and the price of food and a variety of other things. So it just, again, illustrates the fact that we are in a very difficult time. And I think we illustrated this by, as we said last week, we had a truth team. And when we ended the week, we hadn't even gotten to halfway. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we've now gotten to past 2/3. And maybe some more will come in, and we'll see where that is. But we are facing, I think, and other ministries will be facing, because I'm well aware of some other ministries that have been doing fundraising, other radio stations doing fundraising, and we're kind of heading into some very significant financial headwinds. And so I wanted to maybe pass that on to you if you're involved with a church or Christian organization, ministry of some sort, to pay attention to that as well. But nevertheless, that is the world that we find ourselves in right now. It is the one that certainly will be front and center, I suspect, as people go to the polls, first in these primaries that are unfolding right now, and then in the general election there in November. But I thought just as we wind down for today, it's been Holy Week, and we've spent a little bit of time talking about that, even today, talking about all the archaeological evidence for the historical reliability of the Bible. But tomorrow is Good Friday, and I have a commentary on Good Friday, which I thought would be appropriate today, if for no other reason than, of course, tomorrow is a day in which believers around the world will talk about and commemorate the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It's a time in which we go to church. It's a time in which we recognize that it was a dark day before, of course, the resurrection. And it leads to the question that I get every once in a while. Why do we call it Good Friday? Why don't we call it Bad Friday or Dark Friday? And, over the years, people have put out different theories, and I thought I'd kind of set some of those down just for a moment, because some have argued that, well, you could call it Good Friday because something good came out of it because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And certainly that is true theologically. But I don't think that's the linguistic origin of the term Good Friday, although if that's what you want to use as a way to talk about that or call it Crucifixion Friday, certainly that is the case. Others have suggested, well, Good Friday, but maybe that comes from the shortening of words like God's Friday. Although you could see that suggestion in some of these articles out on the internet, there really isn't any connection between God and good, and I just have to say that's probably more linguistic speculation. But more likely, it really just comes from the linguistic past. We find ourselves with words that mean something different. This is a place where I should bring in my producer, Steve, because he does Shakespeare, and he's well aware of some of the words that are used in Shakespearean plays that when you hear them, you go, what does that mean? Well, it meant something different centuries ago than it means right now. And the argument, I think, and the very good argument is that Good Friday comes from the older meaning of the word good. And that is good also used to mean holy. And so you could begin to see how that could be the case. So we could think of Good Friday as Holy Friday. And by the way, I think that fits very well with other languages. If you go into some other languages, they refer to tomorrow as Sacred Friday or Passion Friday. That makes a great deal of sense as well. But nevertheless, tomorrow is a time in which we are going to commemorate the fact that God's wrath was poured out on Jesus. He was sinless, and thus he was the perfect sacrifice for our sins. He paid the penalty that we deserve to pay. As maybe you remember the song, he paid a debt he did not owe because I owed a debt I could not pay. And Good Friday, I think, is, of course, the most momentous weekend in the history of the world. And because of the death of Jesus, we can receive a free gift of eternal life. And if you've been listening to this broadcast for some time, we don't very often encourage you to commit your life to Jesus. We recognize that most of our listeners probably are Christians, but I also recognize that whenever we have had an individual on the program that has maybe had an evangelistic close, we find out about some people that were driving in their cars, or they were listening on the radio, or they saw this later on a YouTube or Facebook channel, and they once again came to grips with the fact that they had a need for eternal life and that they are sinners cut off from God, and because of the death of Jesus, we can receive the free gift of eternal life. Because of the resurrection, we can also know that there is life beyond the grave. And so as we head into this so-called Easter weekend or Resurrection weekend, whatever you want to call it, there should be a cause for great celebration, but also a cause for tomorrow during Good Friday or Sacred Friday or Passion Friday, whatever you want to call it, Crucifixion Friday, maybe a time to reflect once again on what Jesus did on the cross for you. Well, that's all we have for today. I hope that you will take the time to visit our website. You're going to find many of these very good articles we've quoted from today. My commentary tomorrow, of course, is on Good Friday. My commentary today is the piece by Charles Cook on Against Misery. And you might even think about saying a prayer for the President, the Secretary of State, and how about saying a prayer for the 4 astronauts and mission control and a variety of other things that are taking place over this weekend. That's all we have. And first of all, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We will encourage you to listen to our broadcast tomorrow by tape. And we'll see you back here on Monday right here on Point of View.
If we want to see America's godly heritage restored, we have to embolden everyday Americans to stand up for truth. And we all need to do our part. At Point of View, we are doing our part daily to provide trustworthy information and the biblical perspective that people need to make sense of our world. But we cannot do that without you. Last week, as you probably know, Point of View highlighted the incredible impact of Truth Team supporters, those who make Point of View possible, and we had a goal of raising $150,000 in 7 days. Being very honest with you, we came up short of that goal, but you can still help us get there. Take a moment right now to make a difference for the nation and for our future. Give today by visiting pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.